In the last section, we spoke about how we're going to communicate information from the search bar up to the app. So step one is to refactor our app into a class-based component. I'm going to open up my app.js file, and I'll go through the same process that we've already learned for refactoring a functional component over to a class one. So I'm going to find the app declaration right here, and I will replace it with class app extends react.component. Then inside there, I'll define my render function, and I'll put a curly brace on the other side of it, like so. And then finally, I'll make sure that I remove the semicolon on the very end of the class. Okay, so that looks good. So now we can define a callback function on the app. I think we'll give it the same name that you saw over here. We called it onSearchSubmit. So I'll define a method onSearchSubmit. And we're going to say that this thing gets called with our search term, which I'll abbreviate simply as term. So for right now, let's just console log that term and make sure that it shows up inside the app. Now we can take this method and pass it down into the search bar as a prop. So I'll say onSubmit, pass in onSearchSubmit. Now notice the name that I use here. I said onSubmit. On our form element back inside of search bar, here's the search bar. On the form element and the input right here, we have to call these props or these things that function as callbacks onSubmit or onChange. With these normal JSX elements, we have to use these very specific names. But when you pass in properties or callbacks to components that you and I author, we can call them anything that we want. So I decided onSubmit, I could have just as easily called this something like run me when user submits or something like that. We can call it anything we want. But in general, I just kind of thought onSubmit kind of makes sense. I want to run this function anytime that the search bar is submitted. So onSubmit, run this function. To me, it kind of makes sense. But if you think that there's some other name here that would make more sense, feel free to go for it. Just remember, you can't do that same thing whenever you are passing a prop and a callback to a normal JSX element. All right, so now inside of onFormSubmit, rather than console logging out our term, we instead want to call onSearchSubmit, which was passed in as a prop to this component. So now remember, anytime that we pass a prop down into a component that we are creating, we refer to that prop with this name. So inside of the search bar, to reference that prop, we would say props.onSubmit. That is a reference to the function that got passed in up here. Now, just one little issue here. Every time that we have made use of props so far throughout this course, it's always been in a functional component. This is the first time that we are making use of props inside of a class-based component. One little difference between the two. When we are in a class-based component, we reference the props object with this.props. That's it. That's the only difference. So to get access to the callback that was passed from the app down to our search bar, we would reference this.props onSubmit. So then I'll make sure I call that, and when I call it, I'll pass in this.state.term, like so. All right, so that's it. I think we're now ready to test this. As a quick reminder, just one quick run through here. So we're now saying that whenever a user submits the form, we are going to run onFormSubmit. Here's onFormSubmit. We take the event, we prevent the default behavior that would cause the page to refresh itself, and then we look at our props object and we call the function that was passed into this thing as the onSubmit prop. And we invoke that function with this.state.term. Here is that function. We passed in onSearchSubmit to the onSubmit prop. So this is the function that ultimately is going to be invoked. And for right now, we're just going to console log. All right, so I'm going to flip back over. I'll put in some text here and then hit enter. And yep, we see some term that right there. And you'll notice that it was console log from the app.js file on line 6. So here's line 6 right here inside of the app.js file. So that's pretty much it. So now inside of here, we can write some code to go ahead and take this search term and actually make a request to get a list of images. So let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to start talking about data loading inside of our application.